Good morning once again. Happy March. No one likes March except Bob. Kim? Any other March lovers? No? Barbara? Okay, great. For the rest of you, April is around the corner. Today we have Daniel chapter 5, so go ahead and get situated. We've been going through the book of Daniel for the last couple of months. And for those of you who have been here, you know that the first half of the book of Daniel, the first 6 chapters, basically we have these stories that were compiled, essentially one per chapter. And then starting in chapter 7, things are going to get a little weird. So look forward to that as well. But here we are in this 5th chapter, so the 5th story, more or less. And today we must do the chapter in its entirety. So 31 verses. Whenever we do have this amount of verses, I try to divide it up into 2 Sundays, but oftentimes in a narrative, it's kind of hard to just cut the story in half. So, as you would imagine, a lot of reading, and I'll make some comments regarding this story. It's a well-known story. However, out of all the stories in Daniel, this is probably the least known stories, but they're all very well known. Most of us are familiar with these stories. And here we have, again, Daniel chapter 5. I mentioned to you last week that Nebuchadnezzar now does not exist anymore. So there is a historical gap between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar, he reigned for about 40 plus years. And then this is 20 years after his death. The throne changed hands quite a few times, and now the story consists of a different king, a new king for us. Actually, he was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and we'll make references to that in a bit. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll read a small portion of the text, and we'll pause, make some comments, and then move forward. Again, there's going to be a lot of reading. It's a narrative. You got to take it one step at a time. And at the end, we'll just kind of conclude it with one main idea, one thought, one lesson that hopefully we can meditate more on as we go home and try to digest this throughout the week. So again, Daniel chapter 5, I'll read the first 5 verses, and you can follow along either in your Bibles, your gadgets, the projection on the screen, or you can just hear my pleasant voice. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and the silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and the lords, his wives, concubines, might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So let's stop right there. So once again, now we are introduced to a new king, Belshazzar. And even though here he is mentioned, he is referenced as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, that term that he was, Nebuchadnezzar was his father, it essentially just means ancestor. So you have, again, the throne had changed hands a few times, and this is very likely the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar after a 20-year period since the death of this very, very famous king. And here within this context, Belshazzar, like many emperors and kings like to do, they rounded up the troops to have a party. All the lords and their concubines and anyone who was anyone very likely attended this occasion. And the interesting thing here about this particular scenario is the fact that Belshazzar makes a grave error. He makes a really bad decision. Now, obviously, it's funny about bad decisions. At the time, they do not seem like that bad. Wouldn't you agree? And it's only usually in hindsight, after the fact, that you realize that you have made a really horrible decision. We don't know exactly why he made this decision. Again, these were the relics, the vessels, the items that were taken from the temple when Nebuchadnezzar, basically almost 60 years prior, had destroyed the city and taken the captives to Babylon, Daniel being one of these captives. But again, some of these treasures were taken from the temple, and they were there just stored for all of this time. Now, this particular king decided that it was a good idea to actually utilize these items to drink and eat from. Again, we don't know exactly why. Maybe, possibly, he had heard stories about prophets from this foreign god that had mentioned that the Babylonian Empire would eventually cease to exist, be taken over, would have its demise. So he would want, basically he might have wanted to show off by saying, look, I know that these stories are out there, but they're mostly myths, and my kingdom will remain for as long as I live. And here, I am showing you an example of my prowess, to the point where I'm going to take these blessed holy relics, these items that were taken from this foreign god's temple, and utilize it for very, very common purposes, basically to party and to drink from. So they were there just having a good time, doing what emperors, lords, and concubines do. And while they were doing this, not only again were they utilizing these holy items for less than holy purposes, they were also blessing these other deities, these gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And as they were doing this, something odd occurred. Belshazzar noticed something different. He noticed, and how it's described here, it's very hard to imagine exactly how it happened. But basically, he saw a portion of a hand, seemingly a human hand, writing on the wall. And as soon as he saw that, his heart skipped a beat. Now the mentality, now the mood changed from partying to worrying. And obviously here we have the genesis, or where that famous saying comes from, this proverbial phrase, the writing is on the wall. I was literally like 1 week old or ago that it dawned on me. I realized that this is where it came from, and I had heard this story many, many times, and it just kind of, rang true to me as far as the origins of this particular saying, the writing is on the wall. Now, we know that this basically means danger is imminent. Something bad is coming, right? It's just about time and all hell is going to break loose. So here we have, again, the genesis of this saying. This probably rings a little bit different for parents of toddlers. The writing is on the wall. I remember my kids, they probably didn't know what a pen or a marker was until they were like 7, because we would not allow any markers or any pens to be utilized by them. As soon as they, received it as a gift or something, we toss it in the trash. That and the fact that they probably didn't know that batteries could be replaced in loud toys. You know those semi-educational toys that you receive, they receive, but you witness them receiving and you're like, oh, wonderful, that's great. What a blessing. You're cursing the Mattel gods because you know you're going to have to put up with that noisy semi-educational toy for a while, and we did so. But again, as soon as the original battery ran out, it was just tossed because there is no such thing as replacing batteries, right? Close parentheses. So here again, the writing was on the wall. Danger was imminent. Something really bad was going to happen. Now, based on the previous chapters, we notice that there's sort of a trend here in most of these stories. Basically, God reveals something to a king. He doesn't know exactly what that is, so he calls upon his subject people, essentially, to try to decipher what this message from God is. And here we have, once again, this ringing true and being similar to the previous story. So let's pick up from verse 6, and we can read all the way to verse 9. And it says here, then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck. And he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. The king Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. So we see this trend repeating. Initially, the king goes to his wise men, the people who are there to give him guidance, to give him some type of insight. These people were, handpicked usually by the king himself because he trusted them to give sound advice. And here we had another situation that they were called upon to decipher this particular message that was written on this wall. Now, as we've seen before, this group could not do a thing. We don't know exactly what the inscription looked like. It is very likely that they couldn't even recognize the font type that was there plastered on the wall. They could not make sense of it, which this was very likely aggravating to the king and just added to the whole anxiety that he was already naturally feeling. Now, if we consider history, and here we're trying to intertwine the biblical account with, the documented history that we have available in books and museums and whatnot, we know that the Babylonian Empire was about to cease to exist. The Persians were actually on their way to attack the city of Babylon. Ironically enough, very likely while they were partying. So, very bad timing. And we know, and I've already described the fact that even though the Babylonian Empire, we had an older version of this, and this is the Neo-Babylonian Empire that was kind of resurrected after a period of about 1,000 years. So this, it's a few hundred years prior to the time of Christ. We know that it was marvelous. It was grand. We've seen the descriptions, more or less, of Nebuchadnezzar, and we can extend that to his empire as well. So even though it was somewhat short-lived, it was really amazing. I mentioned the fact that it had these walls, these very thick walls. I have some measurements here. So the outer walls, as you know, these city kingdoms, they had layers of walls, but the outer wall was especially magnificent. It was basically 17 miles long, 22 feet thick, and 90 feet high. So we can understand why the king was partying, even if there was some type of imminent danger. Based on these measurements and, the geographic location, probably, the moats and the river and the topography of it all, it would be almost impossible for an enemy to try to take over and to destroy and to siege this city. So he was very much at ease, at peace, which is why he was, partying and having a great time. But again, now God was intervening in history. And the king now is very worried. So these people could not decipher the font type, the message, the writing on the wall. So then something else needs to occur. Someone else needs to be called up to the plate to see if they can help. So let's pick up from verse 10 and we'll read all the way to verse 16. And it says here, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the holy God, and in the days of your father, quote unquote, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And the king Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give you the interpretation. We'll actually pause right here. So now Daniel is reintroduced into this story. Chronologically speaking, we know that in the beginning of the book of Daniel, Daniel was just a teen boy. But now you fast forward in history. You can just make, some simple calculations in your head. If in the start of the story, we see Daniel as, maybe mid to late teens, you add 40 plus years, maybe around 45 years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, plus another 20 years since his death. It means that Daniel was around mid to late 80s, close to 90 years old. So here, at this point of the story, he was already semi-retired. Still around, but not as relevant. At one point in time, he held a very prestigious position, was very well known, but now, since there were a lot of, changes of leadership, usually, the new administration wants to bring new blood in, so Daniel was sort of, put to the side. However, it was still known by some that he had this history of doing some amazing things. And there's a reference here of the queen. Very likely this was not the queen as in the wife of the king. Likely it was the queen mother or grandmother. So she knew of these stories. And again, now she is reintroducing Daniel into the picture and to and for the benefits of the current king. So now from verse 13 it says, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives of Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So here we have a repetition of this reward that was originally offered to the wise men of the court, but because they could not decipher the writing on the wall, now the reward was going to be transferred over to Daniel if he could in fact do that which he had done in the past. I chuckle every time I read this, and obviously I've read it a few times as I was preparing this, about the gold chain. I naturally think of, these rappers, just very thick bling around Daniel's neck. I'm sure it was, something a little bit more refined and classy. But anyways, rewards were going to be presented, given, but not only these gifts, but also whoever was able to do this feat would be considered third in charge in the entire empire. So pretty good deal, wouldn't you agree? These are, no wonder this was something that was, again, very alarming to the king. He was willing to do all of this because he was scared. The writing was on the wall. Now let's see what happens hereafter. Picking up from verse 17, going all the way to around verse 23. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your reward to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, languages trembled in fear before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up, and whoever he wished, he put down. Verse 20. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit hardened, in pride he was deposed from his kingly throne. And they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of man. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of man and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, and the gods who hold your breath is his hand. in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. So now, once again, Daniel has this encounter with the king. He is reintroduced into the king's court. He's promised these rewards or prizes or gifts, including this very high-ranking position in the kingdom. Initially, Daniel just says, give it to someone else. Again, he is, borderline 9 years old. What does he need with a thick, gold chain? It's just totally not his style anymore. But he was still willing to do what was asked of him because he was still endowed by this God-given ability to decipher the message of God to whomever God was trying to speak to. But before doing this, Daniel wanted to give the king a little history lesson. Now, bear in mind, this was nothing that the king hadn't heard before. Very much knowledgeable of the great Nebuchadnezzar. Again, very likely his grandfather, but he was the most famous emperor of this particular kingdom and in general. So all of these stories he probably grew up with and was very much knowledgeable of, including the story when God humbled the great Nebuchadnezzar. And it's interesting that while Daniel is telling the story, he is also trying to apply it to this new king. And he gives a sort of indictment based on the knowledge of these stories. What does he say? Let me read again verse 23. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heavens. They have brought vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, and wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, and the gods who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. So that was the point. God demanded glory. Previous to this verse, on verse 22, again, Daniel said, you knew all this. So the issue wasn't ignorance. It was not lack of information. The issue was not willing to apply the truths, the ethics of these stories in his particular life, in his way of being, in his leadership of this great empire, amongst his subjects and his people, being an example, being what God wished for him and for everyone else. He was accountable. So here we have the indictment, but now we go forward to the actual interpretation, because this was kind of the point of the story. Daniel needed to interpret the writing on the wall. And what was the writing on the wall? Verse 24. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So these words were written on the wall. Again, very likely the font type was something unknown to everyone in that particular time. even though here in the Bible it is transcribed in Aramaic. But again, the original text on the wall looked completely foreign. And each particular word meant basically a sentence, meant an idea. And the idea was your numbers, the days of your reign, they're counted. It is imminent. Destruction is before you. Your kingdom will be divided, will be taken away from you, and will be given to someone else. Interestingly enough, when the king heard this, instead of being upset, he just accepted it and gave Daniel all of the rewards that Daniel didn't even want. Yet, I guess he couldn't deny it because, again, it's the king. What are you going to do? No, and run away? So he received the rewards and the awards and was placed in this very privileged, high-ranking position. Basically, Daniel got another promotion. However, this was the shortest known promotion in ancient history. The shortest, because what occurred? That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So here, as we weave the documented history again that you see in the history books and other types of periodicals, movies even, fact is, the Persians were at hand. They were ready for battle and attacking as all of this stuff was occurring. But as I said, the city was very fortified. So what the Persians did was they were able to somehow divert the river, the Euphrates, to the point where they could cross it, and then the levels of water, you can imagine, some sort of a moat around the city, they were lowered to the point where they could cross these underwater gates that for whatever reason, they were not being guarded and even very much opened, to the point where the Persians were able to enter the city. And historians tell us that it wasn't even much of a fight. It's almost like they were welcomed in, they took it over, and everyone, either ran away, were killed, the king was, slaughtered, but it was not even a battle. It was, very likely one of the easiest conquering of any kingdom in ancient history. That's literally how people describe this portion of history, which sort of matches up what we have in the Bible. And now we have the demise of this last king of the Babylonian Empire and the empire itself. Something that mimics, it parallels that other prophecy that we saw in the beginning of the book of Daniel, where we see that Nebuchadnezzar was the golden head, but his empire would be preceded by other people and other empires that would eventually, be very influential in that portion of the world. So here now the Persians and the Medes were the ones that would be in charge. Now we've, essentially finished this story and read all the verses. I made some comments, gave a little bit of historical background as to what was happening here. But now I want to focus on an aspect of this story in our conclusion here that is the most important. The essence of this story and the lesson that we have, that we can derive from it, that we can glean from it. And again, I want to read the words of Daniel as he was interacting with the king. He said on verse 22, "But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. Essentially, what Daniel is saying, he's pointing to a very particular truth. It is a truth that applied to Belshazzar, definitely, but it is also a truth that applies to all humans in all eras, in all times, in all places of the world, regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, cultural background, regardless of ranking, regardless of preferences, likes or dislikes, and any other variable that either unites us or separates us as a humankind. He was pointing to a truth that escapes none. What is the truth that he was pointing to? It's the fact that he and all of us are inexcusable. What does that mean? We do not have an excuse before God. These words parallel something that Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1. When Paul was initiating his argument pertaining to how God deals with the entire world. Again, everyone from all times, Jews and Gentiles, throughout history, current day, before, and in the future, Paul wrote these words in chapter 1, verse 20 of Romans. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And then he goes on and on and on to describe their fallen reality that pointed to the fact that they had no excuse. We can try to make excuses. We are very good at making excuses, exceptions to the rule, over-explaining things, giving reasons as to why. But human beings essentially are without excuse before God. All have this ability, this God-given ability to know God. In a general way, everyone has this revelation from God through the created world. And this is a blessing, but it actually brings judgment. The fact that God revealed himself to the world in its entirety and did not give exceptions to the rule, regardless of whatever native peoples you can think of in the edge of the world throughout history, or your neighbor, a family member, a coworker, or anyone else that you have interacted with throughout your lifetime, God has revealed himself to him and to her, which is why they have no excuse, which is why the writing is on the wall. From birth. You don't even have to know how to pick up a magic marker and inscribe little pictures on your parents' walls. From birth, the writing is on the wall. We are considered fallen. We are recognized as people who have strayed away from God. God deals with us as rebellious because that's who we are. None of us, not one, can ever make the claim that that does not apply to us. No excuses. We know enough. We have enough information. It has been revealed to us. But God does not leave us in that horrible condition, that hopeless situation, even though from the very beginning, the writing is on the wall. He has provided one that is able to utilize this divine magic eraser that is able to cleanse the filth, the dirt, the condemnation that we have all deserved since the beginning. And because of this, there is no other solution to our problem. It is only through Christ Jesus, who died for us at the cross, sacrificed himself on our behalf, was willing and able to pay the price for our sins. Because of him and because of that miraculous deed, we are enabled to find salvation in him, for otherwise we'd have no excuse and would head directly to the place where we deserve, the bad place underneath. So thank God for that. Thank God for that. We need not have excuses, for we have the answer to our problem. So for those who have already accepted that, wonderful. Thank God for that. And if you're not in that situation, the writing is still on the wall, yet God is willing and able to make himself available to you through the deeds of his Son to save you from this condition, bring you home as part of his family, becoming his child, saved, redeemed, blessed. Amen.